Okay, it's my very great pleasure to be here today and to welcome everybody to this symposium on language diversity, variation, multilingualism and standardization. And it's a particular pleasure to be able to welcome you to a symposium that's a collaboration, an international collaboration between the University of Nottingham, the Federal University of Uberlândia, and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Apologies for the pronunciation. My name is Nicola McLelland, and I've been working on all of these notions from some sort of perspective, especially the history of them, to some extent from the late medieval period onwards, and on Germany and German. But I have started to take a wider look, including in taking in some Asian perspectives at some point as well. So this joint event has been made possible thanks to the fact that both the universities allowed my colleagues here, Silvia Rodrigues Vieira and Maíra Córdula, to have a leave of absence to come to the University of Nottingham for a semester. And actually, it was just a happy coincidence that they ended up coming at the same time. It's been really great. And as always happens with these kinds of opportunities, you don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but I can only say it's really exceeded my expectations. It's been a real pleasure to be working alongside with these two colleagues who I think are now also my friends to some extent. So thank you very much, Silvia and Maíra. And I should also say that it was Silvia and Maíra who came up with the idea of this symposium and put it together. So, and I hope that just as our time together in Nottingham has brought some new connections and illuminated things that we've all been working on, but from different new perspectives, that what we're doing today will do the same thing. So to some extent, I think for all of us, some of the colleagues are people we know well, and some of them are people we don't know and whose work we don't know. And we're really looking forward to thinking about some of these notions and hearing other people's thoughts from different perspectives and giving us some new insights and new ideas. So thank you very much to everybody for being involved, and thank you especially to Silvia and Maíra, and to our backstage supporters who are, I think, Anna and Alessandra, is that right? So that brings me on to some practical points. We will have a list of attendance put in the chat by our assistants. And I think if you want a certificate to say that you've attended, you just fill your name in on the chat. That's right. Please also use the chat to ask any questions, and feel free to ask your question in English or in Portuguese, or I guess maybe another language. And between us, we will get it translated into a language that someone can definitely understand and answer as best they can. We will have sort of structured question and answer sessions with our panel participants. And then at the end of each of our 3 panel sessions, we'll move on to a sort of open question session. So please feel free to ask your questions then. In terms of our structure of sessions, after this introductory session, we will have a 10-minute break. We learned these things from COVID, that we need to build in some breaks. And then we'll move on to our second panel with our guest speakers, Gladys Massini-Cagliari, Clara Keating and Natalie Braba in the second panel, with a focus on perspectives on language diversity and multilingualism. And then in the third panel of the day, we will have our speakers, Carlos, I'm really sorry, I can't read my own writing now. Faraco, I'm so sorry, I wrote it down so that I would get it right. Professor Carlos Faraco, Paul O'Neill, and Liv Walsh, who's a colleague here at Nottingham. And we'll introduce them properly and formally at the start of each panel session. So have I covered all the housekeeping rules, all the practical points? Okay. So in that case, I think we will move into this panel session and get started. I am going to hand over in a few minutes, first to Maíra and then to Silvia, who've got short presentations to give. Before I do that, I'm going to say a little bit myself about my own background and what these terms that we've got in today's symposium mean to me. So we've got 4 key terms in our heading: diversity, variation, multilingualism, and standardization. And I'm interested in all of these, but from different perspectives. And it's been really useful actually being made to think about words like this and bring them into connection with each other. I don't think I've done it in quite this way before. So I'm really pleased to have been made to do that. I'm going to tackle the terms in reverse order, actually, so backwards. And I'm going to start with the last one in our list, which is standardization, which I think is the thing that I started working on first amongst those labels. And when we talk about language standards and standardization, we tend to be thinking about 2 intertwined things. There are many quite refined models of language standardization now, starting with Ina Haugen and right up to a brilliant overview by Wendy Ayres-Bennett in the Handbook of Language Standardization in 2022. I obviously can't do justice to that whole tradition here, but in any of those models, we're thinking broadly when we talk about language standardization as selecting what we're going to standardize, what variety, codifying it, setting down the rules in some way, elaborating the language in some way, so perhaps creating more complex structures, syntactical structures to discuss ideas in writing, or introducing new vocabulary to be able to cover new topics, and then some form of getting the word out about a standard language, disseminating it, whether it's through education, so some form of dissemination and some way of ensuring or trying to ensure acceptance amongst a wide group of in the speech community, and then a process of maintaining that standard, which in itself is a whole topic. So when we talk about those elements, selection, codification, elaboration, and dissemination or acceptance in some way, we're thinking of 2 perspectives there. In one way, we're thinking about things that relate to the language itself, corpus planning. We're thinking about when we codify and elaborate the language, we're looking at the language itself and doing something to the language. And then at another level, we've got the status planning, where we are looking at how the language is perceived, what status does it have, how accepted is a language variety, which variety do we select as the one with the status. Anyway, the process of standardization has the effect of reducing variation and increasing uniformity within a particular variety that is then expected to be used for particular purposes. So that's the first perspective. We can describe that as a range of processes and things that we do. The second element that's already implicit in some of this is the ideological aspect of language standardization. So there's an ideological perspective shift where varieties start to become placed in a hierarchy, hierarchized, I think I can say in English, according to which the standard variety is ranked higher, has more prestige attached to it than other varieties. And that has real world implications for a lot of speakers. We'll come back to that when we're thinking about diversity and variation, because a language standardization can be about social control and social power, as well as just doing something with language. So my interest in the theme of today's symposium began with this interest in standardization. And I was interested in the history of standardizing German, the language I work on, looking at the first grammars of German that were ever written. And even at that early stage, when I was looking at textbooks from the 16th century, multilingualism was actually relevant because the first grammars of German, the first ever attempts to describe the grammar of German, were written with learners of German in mind, so not native speakers, but people who were maybe speakers of French or some other language and who were trying to learn German. At the time when I was writing about these grammars, I noted that in passing, but apart from that, I really didn't think about it at all. And that was very typical, I think, of the mindset at the time that of scholarship at that point in time, that we were focused on we were focused on one language. My specialism is German, and I think about German. And that was reflected in the kind of research that we did. And it took a while to start thinking about this other perspective of actually, even from the very beginning, standardization was involving non-native speakers or learners of the language. Standardization in German is a really fascinating topic in terms of what factors determined which variety was chosen. So there are religious factors. There was a preference in the north for a language that was more like Luther's language, which had a reaction, so Protestant, Lutheran grammarians, and grammarians from the south who were Catholic had different preferences. There were regional preferences in themselves, a difference between Low German and High German, which are two really different varieties in German, and whose model we were going to take as a basis. So is it going to be the language of the scribes in the chanceries, in the offices of the empire, or of the language of the Bible that's being printed? There were lots of competing factors, as there always are in any kind of standardization, about what to choose as a basis and how to decide what's best German. So for a long time, the best German was held to be in Saxony. And then nowadays, more commonly, people would say it's in the north of Germany around Hanover, which is, of course, where our royal family comes from, our British royal family. So that might have played a role. So as I've said, standardization and multilingualism were linked as I started off, but we weren't really thinking about it very much at that time. And I think I inched towards thinking about multilingualism more when I began working more intensively on the history of how languages have been learned. And in particular, I was interested in how English people have been learning German. So we've got a bilingual situation there, or people seeking to learn a language I started from about 1500, which is where we've got the earliest evidence of people trying to learn German in the UK. It's perhaps worth mentioning that I think we're all agreed that when we're using the term multilingualism, we're using it in a particularly inclusive way. So we're not contrasting multilingualism with bilingualism, but multilingualism is any combination of repertoires, a range of repertoires, whether it is just two, where we could strictly talk about bilingualism, or more a wider range, and also including what we call internal multilingualism, so where there are more than one variety within a single named language, which people are able to switch between and draw on. And I'm sure we'll come back to that day. It's certainly something, come back to that today. It's certainly something that I think German and Portuguese have in common. They have, they're both pluricentric, or I think we'll talk about whether pluricentric is the right label or not. We may come on to that. But certainly that range of varieties and how to think about those in terms of standardization and multilingualism is a theme we can come back to. I don't want this to turn into just a history of my research, but as I was thinking about it, I was struck that many years ago I wrote a couple of articles about code switching in writing, and one, I think they reflect the different ways and the different repertoires that people have available that we weren't really thinking about at the time, even though I was talking about texts from the 16th and 17th century. So in one case, I was looking at a Low German, a sort of a funny dialogue that was published where a student speaks High German and he interacts with a peasant who is speaking Low German. So High German is the kind of the more prestigious variety that the highfalutin, proud student uses, and the down-to-earth, everyday peasant farmer is using Low German. And there we can see that the varieties are being used by the writer of this made-up story in quite a deliberate way. So there's some deliberate code switching going on to signal a particular message. But in another instance, we can find, certainly in the early modern period, lots of switching between German and Latin, where we might want to actually use the term translanguaging, which we haven't applied very much to the past previously, but a much more flexible using of repertoires where both the writer and the audience are just very, very fluent in both German and Latin, and there's no need to observe any narrow rules about which language to use. If a term comes in Latin, there's a switch to Latin and German and back again. So it was fascinating to me that there is this hidden multilingualism not so hidden now because we are uncovering it, but for a long time, national language histories have not paid so much attention to that multilingualism, and it's been interesting reflecting on how it's been there all the way along in research and we haven't been noticing it. So standardization and multilingualism, they came together for me as part of a major project that I was part of called Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals and Transforming Societies. I think that's how you probably stumbled across my name in the first place. And that really made me nail my colours to the mast and look at what is the relationship between standardization and multilingualism, and to think about that link a little bit more explicitly. So I'm just going to mention a few ways in which I think that link is there that we're perhaps not always very conscious of. So the first one I've already mentioned. Often standardization, the grammar writing, the codification is done for learners of a language. So they are people who have another language and they want to learn the target variety. Another aspect is purism, language purism. Often a standard language, particularly when you're at the stage of maintaining it and creating acceptance, there's a sort of there's housekeeping to be done to keep the language in the proper state, in what's deemed to be the correct proper state. And that may involve rejecting a lot of borrowed words or borrowed structures from other languages as being improper. And that's certainly hugely relevant for the European languages today, certainly German, where there's a massive amount of borrowing from English, and people are quite varied in how accepting they are of what degree of English is acceptable in their everyday variety and indeed also in the standard. Another point of intersection between standardization and multilingualism is the influence of bilingual speakers on the language. So if they are acquiring the language, they may use it in slightly different ways, which can be innovative and then end up influencing the shape of the language as it develops. And that's certainly happened with multi-ethnic youth vernaculars in cities. In London, there's London multicultural English, and there are similar varieties in German, and those can in turn feed into what how the standard language develops over time. Another aspect is that the notion of standardization, it was originally a very European notion, and it's been dealing with major European languages that were imitating Latin. And over time, that's been exported to more and more different language situations, so to other languages within Europe, but then also beyond Europe, including to indigenous languages or to minoritized languages within Europe, such as Irish in Ireland, Breton in France, and many other examples like that. And there it's a double-edged sword. What is standardization actually doing to that language? On the one hand, it can be seen as really supportive. It makes some speakers feel like, oh, now my language is a proper language. It's got a label, it's been codified. I take pride in it. It's more visible to other people, and that is seen as promoting the language. On the other hand, it can drive a wedge between different groups of speakers, in that some speakers who are perhaps native speakers of a variety speak something that isn't very like the codified standard at all. They speak something quite different to what's standardized, and they can be left feeling that they don't speak the language properly, even though they are someone who's grown up speaking that language all the time. So it's quite problematic, a double-edged sword when we think about standardization and minoritized languages. I'm going to come now to our third term, working backwards, which is variation. So I have to say, I'm not a variationist linguist at all, but standardization is itself a response to variation and an attempt to narrow down that variation to responding to an inherent feature of what language is like, both at the level of speech communities, different genres, registers, individual sociolinguistic factors. And I've certainly learned a lot about how that applies to Brazilian Portuguese, thanks to these two being with me here and especially talking about it with Silvia. So thank you very much for that. And then finally, our final term is diversity, which is, to me, about social justice, really. It's about involving people from a range of different perspectives, whether that's social backgrounds, different genders, ethnic backgrounds, and so on. So it's about respecting a range of repertoires. And this really hit home with me when I was working on case studies of language standardization in Asia, and began to become more aware of languages that are under pressure as a result of different forces. So within in Tibet, for example, there is pressure from Mandarin, Chinese, and large number of endangered different Tibetan languages. That just happens to be a case study that springs to mind. In the Philippines, there are numerous indigenous languages that again are under threat. So there's that level, kind of the systemic level of whole languages, but also individual speakers and and respecting their diverse repertoires themselves. And within the UK, and I'm sure Natalie will say something about this, Natalie Barber, within the UK, there is very great awareness of some repertoires having higher status than others, and that really impacts on people's confidence in themselves and in what their perceived educational opportunities and their life opportunities. So something that's very dear to my heart, and something that we did as part of our multilingualism project, was have a pop-up museum of languages, which was a chance for people to think about language and to reflect positively on their language and their different repertoires, and just promote different types of languages, not just the ones that you hear about in school and that you get to learn in school. In the UK, that tends to be French, German, Spanish, but to have to raise awareness of the other varieties that people speak, whether it's through their migrant background or different local varieties. So that's what got us thinking, got me interested in the concept of museums of language. And I think that might be a good point to hand over to Maíra. Is that right? Because I think you're going to be talking about that. So that's enough from me. I hope that's given a bit of an introduction to the way in which those I'm thinking about these terms. How everyone else is thinking about them, we'll find out later today. But thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Maíra now and her slides.
Thank you. Hello. We are having a presentation, a short presentation here, yes. And the idea to present a little bit of the reflections that we have been thinking on and during these days. And the title for this presentation is Language and the Museums of Language. And I would like to start thanking first Nicola for accepting me here. And she has been giving lots of insights for the things we have been discussing about, and all the questions, and probably you'll see during the presentation. And I would also like to thank CAPES, the funding agents from Brazil, for funding this period of time here, which has been really fruitful. And the committee, CAPES, that prepared everything at the university and made it possible for us to submit our projects for this international moment, and trying to get global engagement. And also I would like to thank the postgraduate program on linguistic studies, the PGL at UFO, especially our coordinator, Professor Cristiane Brito, who has, with her organization, has made it all possible for us to submit a proposal for CAPES UFO and be able to be here and have some time to think a little bit about multilingualism and museums of language. So I'll start with some background, and then followed by the current development of the research and the final considerations. So when I would like first to start talking about multilingualism from a practical perspective, so from Brazil and the UK, and I'll bring just one project among different projects. The one that I participate, which is the Multilingual Teenagers, which in Portuguese is a project called Adolescentes Poliglotas, and it's an outreach program. It started in 2019. It was designed and implemented by a colleague of mine at the Institute of Language and Literature, Professor Valesca Souza. And it started in 2019 with Valesca Souza and Cássia Arantes, which is also a colleague from ESEBA, UFO. And last year, I entered a year later in 2020. And last year, Luisa, also a colleague of ours, also took part in this activity, this project. And it has been very interesting to see how we move from an idea of teaching one language to different languages and using all the languages at the same time. So the program has, it's aimed at teenagers, right? And they have meetings, online meetings and face-to-face meetings as well. And they have moments to learn a little bit about in English, in Portuguese, in Spanish, sorry, and in French. So we have the topics, and they can do it in all the different languages. And it's been interesting to see the involvement of the undergraduate and the postgraduate students to see how we can use the different languages during this course. But it's also, the project also includes other activities. So I have here some pictures to show you that there are also the involvement of the international students of the university, so that we can, the students, the teenagers can listen to, we have some videos, and they can listen to different varieties of English. For example, we have English from Jamaica, we have Spanish from different countries, and French as well. So they can learn a little bit about the country, and also about what the students, the international students that are at UFO, what they do in their hometown. And we also have some cultural topics. So here we have one about some instruments, musical instruments from an indigenous community, so they can think a little bit about language and culture at the same time. And we also have some meetings where we invite some international students, and we can have that speaking in English, in French, in Spanish, and in Portuguese, because we have been maintaining the contact with the students that take the course once, and they can come back and talk a little bit about how they are learning language. And it's been interesting to see how this activity can really foster the idea of learning language. Yes, a lifelong learning, and not only one language. So the idea that it's not, okay, so I need to learn just one language and I need to learn it correct. I only use it when I know everything, this idea of knowing everything of a language, but they are using all the language, not all the language, but the language that we use in the course at the same time, and learning and trying to find different ways of learning, and they share those ideas with us. And there are some other activities as well. Due to the time constraints, I cannot describe all of them, but I also have some of the publications here in the slides, and I think we can, I will share the full reference at the end. And so for the UK, I selected just one among many, but it was the one that I know Nicola, and contact her because of this project. It ran from 2016 to 2020, and it was a research project, involved several universities, 6 research strands. There are lots of publications and products, and there is a website full of information online. The full name is Multilingualism, Empowering individuals, just a minute, transforming societies, yes. And the products are very interesting to see. So we have, besides all the discussion, all the articles, the academic articles, I've come across and some of the products, like the toolkits for schools, to be used as schools and to use the teachers can use to value the identity of a multilingual speaker. We have some games as well, online games, so it's interactive, and it tackles the theme of different languages. And the pop-up World of Language is the museum pop-up, which is very interesting to see, in a way to promote this multilingual perspective, especially to students, school students, and I think it's a very good and interesting way of promoting language. So thinking of this pop-up museum, we talked about language as intangible cultural heritage, and we are going to see first the concept by UNESCO, and it's small here, just a minute. It's a long text, so we have some time here to see the... Okay, we have here the definition that the intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO means the practice, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural space associated therewith. That the skills that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize as part of their cultural heritage. This intangible cultural heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment, their interaction with nature, and their history, and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity, thus promoting respect for cultural diversity and human creativity. So this is the definition UNESCO uses because of the policy, and then for the safeguarding policies they will implement for this intangible cultural heritage. And we see that language is recognized as a vehicle. So in number 2, we have the intangible cultural heritage as defined in paragraph 1 above, is manifested entirely in the following domains: oral traditions and expressions, including language as a vehicle of the intangible cultural heritage. So in this definition, language is not really considered as one object, right, as part of the object, but it's included as, of course, a means, the vehicle for this intangible cultural heritage. And safeguarding means measures aimed at ensuring the viability of the intangible cultural heritage, including the identification, documentation, research, preservation, protection, promotion, enhancement, transmission, particularly through formal and non-formal education, as well as the revitalization of the various aspects of such heritage. So we see that we have a wide concept, and it relates to language, but it's not the main concern. And the safeguard includes lots of actions, right? The safeguarding activity. However, we have some limits for this concept. So, as discussed by Barber and Howard, to discuss these 3 possible limitations for this concept, which one of them is that the traditions are safeguarded following a global method that is also shared with other studies. So there is just one method to organize all the different types of traditions. So all these different contexts, and there is only way to organize and promote their protection. And the other limitation would be the list format that UNESCO is right now has this inventory, that's a list, and it may create a metacultural outcome. So we're talking about the culture, but not really promoting or safeguarding the cultural practices. And language is considered only as a vehicle for the transmission of culture, so it's not indeed like the object of the one that could be considered as needed to be safeguarded. But there are, of course, other, UNESCO also has other ways for safeguarding endangered language. So it's not included in this specific convention. I think Barbara and Howard advocates and argues, and we agree with it, that language should be part of the intangible cultural heritage. And according to, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Białostocka, I guess, even though UNESCO recognized the dynamic nature of culture, the organization envisions protection of the intangible cultural heritage in a way that does not account sufficiently for the character of the cultural field and the process of change which are intrinsic to it. So she is highlighting the importance of recognizing the nature of culture, because of that we cannot just freeze it and have just one one moment, and then we do not recognize the changes that come with it. And according to, Gatton, Kanatan, and Somes, involving the community members as stakeholders, it's one of the suggestions, so that the processes of creation, recreation, and even destruction become central to the preservation effort. As culture is not static, some of its elements, whether they be stories, know-how, or linguistic expressions, will necessarily be irrevocably altered, suppressed, or die out. So this is interesting to consider, because the list format may be talking just about the culture, maybe freezing, maybe not considering the dynamic nature of culture, and maybe not respecting the users. So these are the limitations some of the authors say about the current concept of intangible cultural heritage. So after thinking about this concept, we have been moving towards this idea of safeguarding language as intangible cultural heritage, especially for the endangered language. It's very important to promote this kind of safeguarding the language, but at the same time celebrating languages and promoting the multilingualism, even with the ones that we don't have, like generation after generation, for example, in a new country yet, but we still have the multilingualism context. So we can still celebrate this multilingualism and celebrate the language there, even though we are not looking for the safeguarding actions. So considering this, we have the museums of language. We have seen that there are, thinking of the intangible cultural heritage, we could think that language could be in the museum, as we have seen before. There are over 7.5 billion people and 7,100 languages in the world, and only 78 language museums, right? And in this book, there is a presentation, an account of museums of individual languages, museums of languages, different languages, linguistics, about linguistics, the area of studies, language groups, and museums of writing. So there is a variety of types of museums that focus on language. And it's interesting to consider all the challenges and the differences among them. One of the museums of language, we have one in Brazil, Museu da Língua Portuguesa, which was opened in 2006 and reopened to 2021. And one of its goals is to value Portuguese language diversity. It has a very good website with the information. So it occupies three floors at Estação da Luz in São Paulo. We have permanent and temporary exhibitions, reference centers, and there are other projects as well that run during the year. And here we have the website. We have a picture of all the visual. They have different types of installations, interaction or video. And we have here from Yampuran, the upside down text. So for the final considerations, we have been thinking that's a benefit to think of language as intangible cultural heritage. So we consider language the culture, memory, safeguarding, and celebration, if we consider that. Safeguarding policies can be the focus on endangered language, minority, and underrepresented communities, and celebrating language can be beneficial to lifelong education through museums, schools, inclusion activities, celebrating diversity, and also fostering community belonging, etc. And promoting multilingualism is one way of valuing language diversity, especially focusing on the language users. All right, so briefly ending here, I have the bibliography I can share with anyone who would be interested in.
Está no mudo. Now it's all right. Please, I'd like to start now. Could you please put my presentation? Yeah, let's start. So sorry, we have some problems here. Okay. Is it in presentation mode? Not yet. I don't know how can I do that. Do I have to share? But it's share here, but cannot go. I don't know what's happening. Can I close it again? Yeah, it's here, but it does not go to the back. Just go back. Yeah. Please, sorry. Modo leitura. Okay. I'm gonna put in the modo leitura. Okay. I think it is. That's all right? Is it appearing for you?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, now, sorry. Let's start just now. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleagues who organized this symposium with me. Professor Nicola, thank you very much. And Dr. Maíra. I think this is an academic event that not only develops a relevant discussion about important social linguistic themes, but also puts together our main aims in our visit here and University of Nottingham. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who is in Brazil, very early in the morning, in this afternoon European time. I thank my university, my program, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, PPG Leve, Prof. Letras, Federal University of Paraná, with the Professor Faraco, and this university and the Federal University of Uberlândia for broadcasting this event. Well, I have entitled my presentation, The Place of Linguistic Variation in Standardization Models Towards a Plural Standard Ideology. So, taking into consideration the three keywords of our program, besides diversity and the main one and the multilingualism previously explored by Maíra, standardization is my own and my own interest here. Well, after this brief introduction, I think I have to present some very brief theoretical background, and so I would like to show my Brazilian Portuguese standardization treatment through pronormal plural project results. Okay, let's start with the brief theoretical background. It's very common, it's general assumptions when someone think about standard that some general characteristics arises, just like standard is considered something super-regional, uniform, prestigious, typical for formal educated interactions, and something that has to be codified, namely by grammars and the dictionaries. We do not have time to explore historical processes of modeling standard, so we strongly recommend the book. Nicola has also quoted it, The Handbook of Standardization, where Arendt has a great summary of Hogel's model of standardization. But I think we can highlight the four topics that they are proposed. Selection. Norms are selected by agents in society. The selected norms are linguistically codified by agents in grammars, dictionaries, and then society can implement these norms with particular goals through means of formal education, administrative documents, and the accent of this implementation is an important ingredient of this process. And further elaboration of the norms can finally be necessary so that this process can involve renovation, reform. Okay, in this process, it is important to highlight the relevance of codification, as Nicola says in this quotation in the slide. That's why it's important in our research, we have to be involved in the process of modeling standards, as we are in this today event. So, taking into consideration linguistic discoveries, there is an intriguing and basic question arising. If it's a well-known fact that any spoken language is inherently variable and can never be fully standardized, if there is evidence that even speech which is unquestionably and emblematically standard is still variable, why do standardization models codified throughout the world usually search for very narrowly bounded standards? That's a great question. We think that there is, indeed, the answer for this question has to do with the important consideration of Liv Osha, our invitee for today also, that the emergence of the notion that standardization may be best viewed as an ideology. Standard language, as Mirror and Mirror propose, is an idea in the mind rather than a reality. So, the selection process of norms are not only based on linguistic uses in the level of production, but also found in the evaluation of these linguistic uses in the level of perception. So, I summarized by Berman and O'Neill, who is also our participant today. The standard language ideology is applied at least in two directions. On one side, we have the belief that there should be only one single official language in society, that is a monolingual ideology. On the other side, there is the belief that the states need just one standard language, which has a stable and a focused grammar, and whose written form displays minimal variation. So you can observe that these kinds of ideology act against multilingualism, considered not only in the concept of several historical languages, but internally in the same language, as a diagraphy or a diathesis. Well, in summary, I think that it's important to conceive the process of standardization as an ideological struggle between centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centrifugal forces towards diversity and difference, and centripetal force which tries to normalize language and prescribe the way language should be. And so we have this process: standardization, destandardization, restandardization. Well, think of this background: how to build the models towards a plural standard ideology. I think it's really a challenge. Taking into consideration several studies, I can say that the linguists have been trying to do that. If you quote very briefly pluricentric perspective, polycentric perspective, polynomic perspective, we can see that in this kind of background of linguistic proposals, we have a variation included in. For example, in pluricentric perspective, we can consider that each national variety would have its own single standard in equal conditions. So variation is here to a great extent. In another extreme, in polynomic perspective, we have several standards in the same community as a possibility. I think that in what we call polycentric perspective also, we can think about a single standard, okay, but with features, with the traits from several social communicative practices or varieties. That's my personal challenge here in the University of Nottingham. So I would only like to present as an example this kind of effort to contemplate variation, diversity in standardization. I think a brief Brazilian background is important, especially for non-Brazilian audience. Brazilian Portuguese, Brazil, besides Portuguese, there are more than 250 languages, 250 languages spoken in Brazil, but only specific communities, considering indigenous, immigrant, Brazilian Sign Language. But due to several historical facts, although Brazil is a multilingual country, the overwhelming majority of its citizens speak only Portuguese. The very indigenous and the African languages that intertwined with the Portuguese, especially in the past, were crucial in shaping the heterogeneity and the plurality of norms, varieties that are observed today. Sueco, our invitee, is also talking about it. Brazilian Portuguese cannot be treated so as a homogeneous unitary setting, Brazilian Portuguese, because it's multiple, as Brandão de Vieira in press proposes. Well, what's our challenge? Brazilian model of standardization should take into account linguistic diversity. We propose that a kind of a polycentric standardization seems to fit better with our history, our characteristics. In this perspective, it can be assumed that the Brazilian Portuguese standard does not have one new uniform sound, but a heterogeneous mosaic from continuum of variation, space that compose a plural, flexible, standard norm. Well, I try to represent this complexity through this figure. You can see. It have social linguistic factors that I think must be considered in a standardization process. So we have spaces, social status, modality, register style, which can be called the diatopic, diastratic, diamesic, diaphasic dimensions of a variation. Well, if you think in a non-variable standard, I think that is in this center a static point of intersection between these factors. Oh, here is the standard. But indeed, these dotted lines can represent that we have to be elastic in a continuous way to represent gradual traits inside the standard. Of course, it is not, we must highlight that in this model, it's not supposed that all variants, all forms are considered standard. So we have to look also to these areas which are not intersected. We have discontinuous traits in varieties of language. So I think this is also important for society who evaluate the forms, that evaluates the forms. Okay, building our point of view, what would be the best sociolinguistic factor to propose variable centers, variable points in a standard? Well, I think that due to the negative evaluation of non-prestige varieties and due to the need of promoting reading society, the best sociolinguistic factor to guide the model seems to be the diamesic level of variation in written texts, associated with the diaphasic dimension of different text genres. The model goes beyond the simple opinion-oriented debate on combating linguistic prejudice about non-standard varieties, but it proposes a model for promoting the plural language standard ideology. Well, I have no time to detail that, but I can think that in the Pro-Plural Norm Project, a national Brazilian project coordinated by me with the advice of Carlos Faraco, with this theme, I have no time to read all the names, my colleagues. I do not do anything alone. And the proposal of this project is to map a variable morphosynthetic phenomena in textual genres in the spoken written continuum, take into consideration journalistic and academic texts, while conceptualizing standard norm and propose flexible normative guidelines. Here I have only one example from Lima, in her PhD work. She controlled one of the phenomena was the anaphoric third-person plural object, kinds of, in contexts like this, post coming, I already called him. In Brazil, we can say, I already called, eu já chamei. Or I already called him, eu já chamei, eu já o chamei, which in written texts, it appears mainly. Or I called he, the nominative form. In this graph, you can see in orange that the accusative critic, the variant which taken as the most prestigious one, we have that in the more monitored the textual genre is, the greater the use of eclectic pronouns in a continuum, from editorial, article, readers' letters, news, chronicle, interviews, comic strips. So, what can we observe in that is this testing of the model really functions. And we think that it's relevant to observe that there are several uses in the written texts if you consider text genres, and all these uses are published except the expressive forms in the journalistic discourse. So you can see that you observe a continuum of standard forms indeed. Well, I cannot read these slides. I'm going to finish my presentation in 1 minute. But I'd like to say that many students, many colleagues in Rio de Janeiro, but also in the other groups of the project, are in this moment developing all of these themes in this kind of continuum of genres. All my great students with their great works. And also in studies of oral varieties, we can see contribution from this project, mainly those one developed by me and Silvia Figueiredo Brandão, my advisor of my life, with these students, and also in the Prof. Letras program related to education. So I'm going to finish here saying that I think that this project, I'm here with Nicola and Maíra thinking about in this time, University of Nottingham. I thank you a lot for allowing me to think about that. I think that the standards is really not incompatible with the plurality, heterogeneity, diversity. And so I think that we have, as linguists, to recognize norms as standards in the plural, but also define the standard that is stylistic plural, considering text genres and a diamesic continuum. finally, really finally, I think we have urgent tasks in 3 levels. In the research, we have to continue in this project the theoretical descriptive models of standardization, perhaps adding evaluation program also. But in teaching, we have a wide range of opportunities to show in curriculum, materials, practice that show respect for the students' vernacular language, but expansion of the students' repertoire as readers and write, for recognition or for using textual genres, and for the impact of the science, dissemination of scientific knowledge, grammars, manuals for the general public, the flexible standard, training teachers, students, for an inclusive education, media, artists, policies. Okay, that's what I'd like to present. Sorry for my technical problems at the beginning, but I think it is more or less 50 minutes. Thank you very much. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Thanks very much, Silvia.
Okay.
And thank you very much, Maíra, as well. Apologies for the mistiming, which began with me, let's just call it, be honest. So we haven't got time for questions now, but if people do have thoughts, we can perhaps take them up in the conclusion at the very end of today. But for now, thank you very much. Great start to the day, and we will move straight over into the next session, I think. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.